The Catharn Stellar Symposium Hall hovered in the upper atmosphere of Miralis 3, anchored in geosynchronous orbit and outfitted with panoramic crystal walls that overlooked swirling storm systems far below. It was as impressive as it was sterile, a floating cathedral of academia where theory always reigned over action. Every species seated at the long circular assembly table had earned its place through decades, some centuries of peaceful scientific contribution. And then there was Mark Benson. Human, male, mid-30s, dark hair cropped short in that ever-practical military cut, skin tanned from actual sunlight, something many attendees only read about. He sat quietly, a guest from the United Earth Expeditionary Corps, invited more out of protocol than necessity. No one expected insight from a species still grappling with planetary unification. Mark sipped water from a glass and scratched something into a leather-bound notebook, entirely analog and therefore borderline offensive to the tech-reverent delegates. Professor Eldral of the Ventari Triune adjusted his translator coil and gestured with his longer arm at a holographic schematic hovering above the center of the hall. It depicted an upright biped human, of course disassembled into labeled parts, skeletal frames, musculature, neural pathways, and most damningly, a dental chart. Note the flat molars, modest canines, and relatively weak jaw hinge, Eldral said, clicking through overlays of comparative dentition. There is a clear absence of natural weaponry. Additionally, the absence of claws or exoskeletal enhancements confirms the working theory. I hereby present the final classification of Homo sapiens as non-threatening herbivores. Culturally capable, yes. But biologically docile. A ripple of approving murmurs filled the hall. The aquatic Crowleyan ambassador fanned its neck gills in satisfaction. Two Talbury scribes leaned toward each other, chittering affirmatively. Even the usually taciturn Yavari archivist blinked in calm agreement. Eldral turned, his gaze swiveling toward Mark with something approaching polite disdain. Would the Earth representative care to confirm this assessment for the record? Mark looked up slowly, capped his pen, and shrugged. If it fits the data, Professor. There was a moment of amused satisfaction among the delegates. Someone snorted, probably the Blenthian attaché with the dangling eye stalks. Mark leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed neatly over the other. He didn't fidget, he didn't argue, and he certainly didn't seem wounded by the misclassification. If anything, he looked tired, maybe bored. The session resumed with additional charts, mobility analysis, metabolic rates, and cultural dietary trends, heavily redacted. Eldral explained how omnivory claims made by early contact reports were likely social affectations or misunderstood customs, citing lack of documented predation events. They do not hunt, he said. They cultivate, they do not pursue, they harvest. Mark didn't even glance up. At the 60-minute mark, the symposium's melodic chime signaled the midday recess. Delegate pods unfolded into personal refreshment stations. Several beings extruded nutrient paste into receptor valves. Others unfurled feed siphons or unscrewed vapor capsules of enriched protein gel. Mark reached beneath his seat and drew out an unremarkable, rectangular metal lunchbox. It clinked when he set it on the table. He unlatched it with a snap. A moment later, the entire room froze. Nestled inside was a thick, dark red slab of meat, glistening at the edges, juices still pooling in the crevices of its grain. It shimmered slightly in the ambient light, browned at the edges, but unmistakably rare, nearly raw by most interspecies standards. The aroma was immediate and invasive, iron, rich, smoky, animal. Alive with spice and char. Mark pulled out a set of utensils, stainless steel. Cut once, a small hiss of juice. Then he speared the piece with his fork, raised it, and bit clean through. The sound of chewing filled the chamber like a cannon in a chapel. The Crowleyan ambassador shrieked and collapsed backward in a slosh of fluid. The fungal delegate made a noise like tearing paper and curled away from the table. Eldral dropped his pointer tool, claws trembling. The Blenthian attaché vomited into its translator dish. Mark didn't look up. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin. Then calmly, methodically, he poured a few drops of hot sauce from a tiny glass bottle over the next bite. Eldral staggered a step back. That's cooked flesh. Mark glanced up. Yeah, Angus beef. Grain-fed, aged 28 days, pan-seared for 90 seconds aside. Little sea salt, bit of pepper. You consumed it willingly? Sure, why wouldn't I? It's muscle tissue. From a mammalian organism. Yep, we raise them for food, pretty common on Earth. The fungal ambassador emitted a series of clicking pops. Alarm pheromones laced the air. Mark ignored it. Another bite. The Yavari archivist clutched its cultural tablet closer and began updating its dossier mid-meal. On the far side, a skittish delegate from the leafy Haruni Confederacy backed away from the table entirely. But you have no natural weaponry, Eldral stammered. No claws, no fangs. That's why we invented fire, tools, and spice rubs. But you farm your own kind. Mark stopped chewing. No, we farm animals. Livestock, cattle, pigs, chickens. That's worse. He exhaled. Look, we're omnivores. It's not about aggression, it's about survival. Earth's ecosystems are competitive. You adapt or you starve. We learn to use brains over brawn. Teeth and claws can only get you so far. A sharp stick? That changed everything. A sharp stick with fire changed it again. The Crawlian ambassador was revived with a spray mist and quietly wheeled out. Mark looked around, noticing the reactions for the first time. You guys seriously didn't read the dietary disclosures, did you? The fungal delegate turned a deeper shade of purple. He continued, less casually now, sensing the tension. We don't hunt because we're apex predators. We hunt because we had to. Early humans weren't fast or strong, but we could track wounded prey for miles. We'd follow herds for days without stopping. That's how we beat everything else. He held up the fork. This is civilization. This is restraint. The silence was palpable. Eldral opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Across the room, one of the Haruni delegates whispered, "They eat flesh by choice." Mark sighed. "We also eat plants, fruits, grains. We make pastries. You ever had a croissant?" No response. Didn't think so. A Talbari scholar tentatively raised one hand. "Do you consume them alive?" Mark blinked. "What? No, of course not. That'd be, what kind of monster do you think I am?" There was a collective shrug of uncertainty around the table. Eldral finally found his voice. "This requires immediate reclassification." He fumbled with his hollow tablet, fingers shaky, and began rewriting the entry for Homo sapiens. Omnivorous. Tool-using. High metabolic resilience. Opportunistic consumption habits. Culturally embedded carnivory. Mark leaned back, finishing the last bite, eyes distant. "You people need better travel advisories." The updated dossier pinged across the delegates' tablets. Several gasped. In the corner, one ambassador searched Terran cuisine. He dropped the tablet a second later, face twisted in visceral revulsion. Mark recapped the hot sauce bottle, wiped his hands, and folded his napkin neatly. "So, ready for the afternoon session?" Eldral's eyes still hadn't left the lunchbox. The afternoon session began, technically, though began, implied a level of mental cohesion that was, for the moment, beyond most attendees. Professor Eldral resumed his place at the podium with the strained poise of someone clinging to professionalism by their secondary nervous system. His upper set of eyes twitched slightly. He tried to resume the lecture, voice composed, tail stiff with effort. "As we return to our examination of xenobiological classifications," he said, "we acknowledge the need for periodic reassessment. Science, after all, is a self-correcting process." Someone in the back coughed a wet, fluttery sound from the Yavari archivist. It had not stopped typing since lunch ended. The fungal ambassador had not returned. The Crawlian was recovering in the medical bay, reportedly repeating the phrase, "They chew bones," to the nurse drone on loop. Mark Benson sat where he had before, lunchbox stowed, hands folded, face neutral. He hadn't spoken since his last bite. That somehow made everything worse. The committee will henceforth refer to Homo sapiens as opportunistic omnivores, with noted adaptations for both predation and agrarian development, Eldral recited. Their lack of natural armament is offset by tool usage and environmental manipulation. Their cultural practices exhibit a high tolerance for bioethical variance and resource exploitation. He took a breath, then promptly deleted the word docile from the prior classification in real time. No one looked surprised. Mark finally cleared his throat, politely. May I add something, Professor? Eldral hesitated. Of course. Mark stood. His joints cracked softly, a reminder that unlike most in the room, he had actual bones that bore weight under gravity. I think it's important you understand, we're not dangerous because we eat meat. That's a side effect. There was a pause. We're dangerous, he continued, because we'll do whatever works. If that means growing rice in swamp mud, we'll do it. If it means spearing mammoths in the snow, we'll do that too. We adapt to win. Even if it's slow, even if it's ugly. The Tal'Bari scribe glanced sideways at the others, visibly unsettled. A few tentacles recoiled beneath the table. Mark noticed. I'm not trying to frighten anyone, he said, voice low. But when you classify a species, you have to look at more than just the bones. You have to ask, what did they do with them? He nodded at the display behind Eldral, where human skeletal charts still hovered. We broke them, and set them. We splinted our wounded. We made levers to lift boulders. We carved paths through forests. We didn't evolve into apex predators, we built our way there, brick by bloody brick. The room was still, almost reverent. We don't have claws, Mark added, but we make knives. He sat back down. Silence stretched another beat before the Blenthian attaché tentatively tapped its translator. Do you still engage in physical hunting? Today? Not in most places, Mark said. Now we breed animals in controlled environments, domesticated them millennia ago. It's more efficient. And the animals consent? Mark tilted his head. No. The Blenthian's entire face drooped downward in horror. Eldral coughed, redirecting. Let us now transition to terrestrial adaptation studies, yes. He clumsily brought up a chart of planetary environments, deserts, tundras, toxic swamps, and highlighted areas of known human colonization. The chart populated with small blue flags. Then more flags. Then more. By the time it stopped scrolling, several delegates were visibly disturbed. A Haruni muttered. They nested in sulfur vents? We needed the lithium, Mark offered. And the radiation zones? Good insulation and shielding. Took a few tries, lost a few crews, got better. Another delegate asked, Your people survived long-term exposure to cryogenic temperatures on Europa too? Mark hesitated. Well, the first wave didn't. Second wave had better insulation. Third wave cracked the metabolic stasis. That colony's still running, 37 years now. Murmurs spread. The fungal ambassador peeked in from the side corridor, immediately turned around, and fled again. Eldral stared, one claw twitching near his translator node. And you are not disturbed by these casualties? Of course we are, Mark replied, more serious now. But survival isn't clean, it's not tidy. We bury our dead, mourn them, and keep moving forward. That's how we honor them. You think we like the suffering? No, but comfort was never our evolutionary strategy. Adaptation was. The Crolian nurse entered briefly to retrieve something. Upon seeing Mark, it made a U-turn so fast it nearly tipped over its anti-grav cart. Eldral took a shaky breath and shifted topics again, clearly floundering. Then let us examine physiological tolerances. Temperature, pressure, oxygen, variability. A new chart. It showed color-coded tolerance ranges. Humans had modest lines in most categories, but there was a footnote flashing red. Eldral expanded it. It read, Species exhibits unusually high trauma survivability under primitive medical conditions. Multiple recorded cases of continued function following broken bones, organ damage, or prolonged blood loss. Recommend further study. Mark raised an eyebrow. You pulled that from Martian station records? Yes, a shuttle crash. One of your engineers reattached their own arm? With duct tape and adrenaline, yeah. We got him into surgery 6 minutes later. Took him 8 months to recover full function. 8 months? Mark nodded. We regenerate slow, but we're stubborn. The Tal'Bari scribe shook his head in disbelief. Why not replace the limb with a mechanical prosthetic? He insisted on keeping the original, called it a badge of honor. Someone gasped. Eldral sat down, not from decorum, just quietly collapsed into his seat. His eyes were glassy. Mark tapped a few keys on his tablet. A moment later, the main screen shifted to show a human kitchen. Not a lab, not a battlefield, just a warm, wood-paneled space. An old woman basted a turkey in a slow oven. Children laughed in the background. A dog barked. The aliens stared at it like a war crime was unfolding. Mark narrated softly. This is Sunday dinner. It's not violence. It's culture. It's family. Meat isn't conquest for us. It's connection. The dog barked again. The old woman smiled. And we do debate it, he added. Some humans go vegetarian. Others think factory farming's unethical. We fight over it. Make laws, adjust, reconsider. He glanced around the room. That's the part you missed. You saw our molars and our short nails and thought we were gentle, but you didn't ask about our kitchens. 30. A ripple of uncomfortable recognition passed through the room. Eldral, shaken but still a professional, whispered, I stand corrected. Mark inclined his head. The professor updated the classification once more. Cultural complexity exceeds biological aggression. Recommend comprehensive cautionary protocols during diplomatic engagements. A few delegates snapped images of the steak now sealed inside the empty lunchbox. Another searched Terran breakfast foods, paused, then physically recoiled at the term bacon. The Talbari scribe muttered, They cook with fire and shame. Mark looked up again. I brought brownies for dessert. Anyone interested? No one moved. He sighed and unwrapped one anyway. By the third session, the air in the symposium hall had shifted. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a species-wide recalibration of assumptions. Delegates who had previously ignored Mark's presence were now hyper-aware of his every breath. The brownie, largely untouched by others, sat half-eaten beside him. Even that harmless square of chocolate now seemed like some quiet threat. The Talbari scribe had stopped taking notes. His stylus hovered an inch above his holopad, as if uncertain whether recording human customs might somehow invite them. Professor Eldral tried to maintain his dignity, tried and failed. Let us now proceed, he rasped, with cross-species behavioral forecasting. The next chart populated. It featured columns for empathy, territoriality, social bonding, and threat projection. Under human, the fields were wildly uneven. Sky-high empathy, equally high aggression under provocation, unusually complex social loyalty systems, and a peculiar spike labeled ritualized competitive violence. Mark peered at that one. Ah, sports. The fungal ambassador, who'd crept back in during the break, flinched visibly. We call it football, mostly, Mark added, though it doesn't involve feet nearly as much as it should. Eldral tapped at the table like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The behavior matrices conflict, high cooperation rates coexisting with high lethality. We're a pack species. Packs fight harder for each other. That's the trade-off. The Crowleyan nurse had returned to sit quietly at the back. Its neck gills fluttered nervously every time Mark moved. It hadn't spoken, but it was recording. Mark gestured toward the chart. You're trying to quantify us like we're consistent, but context is everything. We'll die for a stranger one day and ghost our own cousin the next. We hold funerals for pets and ignore people on the street. He took another sip of water, the glass trembling just slightly in his hand, whether from caffeine or the slowly mounting tension, no one could tell. Eldral exhaled through his spiracles. We suspected variability, but this level of contradiction— We're not contradictions, Mark interrupted gently. We're consequences. Every strange thing about us has a reason. We evolved for endurance, so we learned patience. We couldn't overpower predators, so we outsmarted them. We didn't just survive Earth, we turned it into a home, even if it hated us for trying. A long silence. Then a voice from the far side of the table, hesitant. Is that why you consume meat? To claim dominance over your ecosystem? Mark shook his head. No, not dominance. Necessity. Scarcity made us pragmatic. Earth didn't hand us a buffet. It handed us droughts, ice ages, plagues. We learned to eat what was available. Sometimes that meant berries. Sometimes it meant bison. And the spices? Asked the Blenthian, voice tiny. Mark smiled slightly. Because survival's not enough. We wanted it to taste good too. This seemed to disturb them more than anything else. Another delegate, this one from the crystalline Iru Syndicate, cautiously raised a thin limb. You described your culinary customs as a form of cultural bonding. Could you elaborate? Mark glanced at Eldral. The professor hesitated, then gestured in resigned consent. Well, Mark began, leaning forward. When someone gets married, we have a big feast. At funerals, there's usually food. Same for births, graduations, promotions. Our best memories are often tied to smells from the kitchen. My mom used to bake apple pie every Saturday. My brother and I would fight over the last slice. He laughed under his breath. Still do, actually. So the consumption of muscle tissue, Eldral said, still recovering, is emotional? Yeah, sometimes. But your emotional milestones are marked by eating the dead? Mark blinked. Not the dead, just meat. The fungal ambassador raised a timid frond. You draw comfort from it? Sometimes. It's not about the food. It's about what it means. It's a ritual, a language, a celebration. The taste is part of it, sure, but the meaning's deeper. But not all of your people eat meat? No, some don't. Some think it's wrong. Some do it for health reasons. Some for religion. Others just don't like the texture. This seemed to flummox the delegates even more than the steak had. You allow internal disagreement on something as foundational as sustenance? Mark shrugged. Of course, we disagree on almost everything. It's how we evolve. Eldral slumped slightly, antennae drooping. Your species is impossibly fractal. We're messy, Mark agreed. But we're trying. That's the other thing you missed. It's not just instinct, it's choice. Every day, we choose who we are, what we forgive, what we protect, what we eat. The Iru delegate tapped its tablet. Would you ever consume an intelligent species? Mark froze. The entire room went still. No, he said firmly. Never. Not even in desperation? Especially not in desperation. There's a line. That's where it island. And who decides where that line lies? We all do, Mark said. Together. The fungal ambassador slowly returned to the table, sat down, said nothing. Across the room, the Krallian nurse finally spoke. Your biology was misclassified, but your psychology is worse. Mark gave a tired smile. Probably. Eldral sat back in his chair, eyes unfocused, as if revisiting his entire academic career in reverse. What do you fear, Lieutenant Benson? Mark considered that. Loss, isolation, failure. No predators? We've outlived most of them. The ones left aren't tooth and claw types. Eldral didn't ask the next question aloud, but everyone in the room heard it anyway. Then, what are the predators now? Mark stood up slowly. His knee popped audibly. He walked toward the holo display and brought up a new image, one he hadn't shown yet. It was Earth. Not the blue marble tourist version. This one showed heat patterns, urban spread, deforestation, ocean acidification, fires in the Amazon, melting ice sheets, plastic swirls in the Pacific, satellite swarms choking the upper atmosphere. This is what we fight now, Mark said quietly. Not animals, not each other, not mostly. We fight time, entropy, mistakes. The room stared. We're not what we eat, Mark continued. We're what we choose to preserve. He turned off the display. So, the next time someone tells you we're just herbivores, ask them what kind of herbivore builds its own apocalypse. No one laughed. Outside the crystal wall, Myralis 3's storm bands glowed in the planetary dusk, swirling like thought patterns too vast to name. The session was called to a recess. No one left their seat. Mark sat back down, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with muscle or bone. The stake had long since settled. The silence now was of another kind. Reckoning. By the time the fourth session began, the Xenobiology Symposium no longer resembled the controlled academic gathering it had once been. The chairs had shifted slightly apart, forming cautious half-circles rather than a unified ring. Multiple delegates had left without explanation. A few remained, stiff and alert, hands hovering near emergency translators or stress neutralizers. Mark Benson sat where he had all along, not triumphant, not smug, just still. There was a new weariness around his eyes, like he knew he'd spoken too clearly, too truthfully. He wasn't sure if that made anything better. Professor Eldral returned from a long absence, posture realigned, scales glossy again after a full dermal recalibration. His voice was steadier, too, though no longer carrying that confident theatrical ring. This closing session will serve as formal amendment, he announced, to the interspecies classification matrix, with specific regard to Homo sapiens. He gestured toward the central holo display. It glowed to life, no longer showing a dissected skeleton or behavioral charts. Instead, it displayed a single word. Revised status. Homo sapiens. Biologically omnivorous, socially fragmented, culturally inventive, psychologically volatile, capable of high empathy and systemic cruelty. Demonstrates adaptive intelligence, long-term planning, ritualized consumption practices, and survival through environmental manipulation. Classification: opportunistic omnivores with unsettling culinary and cultural adaptability. A few gasps escaped the delegates. The fungal ambassador made a noise like snapping bark. The Blenthian scribbled something frantically onto a diplomatic report labeled Terran Protocol, Emergency Revision. Mark raised a brow, but said nothing. Eldral sighed. The Council regrets its earlier misclassification. We failed to include human context, the interplay between instinct and intention, your capacity for cooperation, your layered morality, and your dietary practices. That last one left an impression, huh? Mark said dryly. Several of our more fragile members are still in recovery. I didn't force the stake on anyone. No, Lieutenant, but you forced the truth. That earned a murmur of uneasy agreement. The Crolian nurse finally raised its hand. I would request access to additional data on Terran recovery times. The reports are concerning. Mark gave a small nod. I can submit a full breakdown. Just don't read it before lunch. There was a soft, collective wince. The Talbari scribe finally spoke again, voice quieter than before. Why didn't you correct us earlier, when we called you harmless? Mark thought for a moment. Because it didn't matter to me what you thought until it did. Humans get underestimated a lot. We're used to it. Sometimes, letting others assume you're a sheep gives you a better look at the wolves. And when we found out you weren't sheep, I was hoping you'd listen, not panic. The room paused at that. Eldral, regaining his composure, activated a secondary display. This one scrolled through a list of recommended diplomatic updates, new advisories for contact with human colonies, dietary warnings for Terran cuisine, psychological briefings, travel warnings for anyone with aversions to cooked flesh. One recommendation stood out. Do not observe human cultural meals unless adequately prepared. Across the room, the Haruni delegate, still pale, whispered, their children are taught to cook by burning meat. Mark stifled a laugh. That's not all we teach them. Eldral looked down at his own notes, then back up. Lieutenant Benson, what should the Council know before its next contact with your people? Mark blinked. You want advice? From me? I want accuracy. Mark leaned back. All right, here's the truth. The room stilled again. We aren't invincible. We're fragile, really. Break bones easy, bleed fast, recover slow. But we don't quit. We adapt, overcome, improvise. We remember pain and try again anyway. He rubbed a hand over his chin, thoughtful. We form bonds fast and deep. That's what keeps us going. Families, friendships, found tribes. We'll fight to protect them, die for them. That's not just instinct, that's belief. Loyalty matters to us more than safety, sometimes more than logic. The delegates listened closely now, as if memorizing each syllable. We're curious to a fault, reckless, loud, but also funny, kind when you least expect it. And when things go bad, we mourn hard. But we don't stop. That's our real trait. Not claws. Not fire, not even the meat. Mark tapped the side of his head. It's resolve. Eldral nodded slowly, as if absorbing that down into his third spine. Mark stood up, brushing crumbs off his uniform. Anyway, I think I've said enough. Where are you going? Asked the Blenthian nervously. Down to the habitat ring, there's a hydroponic garden. Peaceful, needed some air. Will you consume anything else today? Mark smiled faintly. Probably just a salad. That somehow disturbed them more. As Mark walked toward the exit, the delegates parted like a neural reflex, giving him space like he radiated heat. Eldral's voice followed him, softer now. Lieutenant, thank you for your clarity, and your restraint. Mark paused at the door. I didn't come here to scare anyone, he said. I came to listen. You just gave me a reason to speak. Then he stepped out into the corridor, the door hissing shut behind him. Silence returned. No one touched their nutrient packs. Across the chamber, the Iru delegate reactivated his tablet and tapped into the Terran Cultural Archive. The screen lit up. Recommended recipes, human classics. Images flashed by: roasted lamb, glazed ham, barbecue ribs, pan-seared tuna. A casserole labeled shepherd's pie, featuring a disturbingly cheerful description. The Iru made a quiet choking noise and shut the tablet off. Eldral returned to his seat, suddenly tired. "Let the record show," he said quietly, "that Homo sapiens is not to be misjudged again." "Agreed," murmured several voices. "And that their food is never to be underestimated." No one disagreed. And far below the orbital symposium, on the garden deck of the habitat ring, Mark Benson sat alone beneath a lamplit fig tree. He chewed quietly through a forkful of romaine and croutons, watching stars flicker through glass. In his lunchbox, the brownie remained untouched. Some things weren't meant to be shared. Not yet.